James Cridland, welcome to Podcasting Made Simple /Pod Talks. So glad you're here to share with us the state of podcasting.
Oh, I'm really pleased that you asked me, Alex. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the first thing I want to get into here is just your contribution in podcasting. One of my favorite things that you do is PodNews, and we'll get into that a little bit, so I'm not going to like spoil the whole thing now, but it's just been such an amazing, helpful resource to the entire podcast industry, not just me, but the whole industry as well. And I just want to say thank you so much for bringing your passion, your desire to help and serve people in this space. Like, I can't speak highly enough about the way that you show up to really make this industry a better place, and honestly have moved the needle doing that. So again, James, just thank you so much for what you do. It means a lot to me personally.
No, Alex, thank you. That's very kind. That's very kind. You're making me, as a British person, making me feel very embarrassed. We're not used to any of that sort of thing.
I'm told, I have a couple guys in my mastermind, they're British, and I'm told I should actually say mean things because that makes them feel better, but I just don't have it in me, man. Yeah. So I'm gonna stick with this, all right? It's all I got.
Indeed.
So something I always love to do is whenever I bring on a pillar of the industry, which is you today, I love talking about some of the past of podcasting and having you share your unique perspective. But before we do that, and we will go more general, but you've got some interesting things that have happened in podcasting to you. So I'm going to just kind of call those out, and then we'll get into more general, and then we'll get through the kind of past of podcasting, where it is today, and then into the future of it. But the first thing I want to mention is have you talk about PodNews. So if you can just quickly explain what that is. And then I think that I heard you got the idea over a beer in a bar in the United States.
Yes.
is where the idea came from. But can you talk about it a little bit?
Yes.
What it is and then where it came from?
Yeah, so it was the Worldwide Radio Summit, which I think is as worldwide as your worldwide baseball things. So I think I was the world. I think I was the worldwide that year.
If you invite one, then it's worldwide.
yeah, exactly. So it was a conversation. It was a conversation after in a pub, and somebody was saying, or in a bar, and somebody was saying, where do you get your news from in terms of podcasting? And I said, well, there isn't anywhere really, is there? And that got me kind of thinking. And so I think it took 2 or 3 weeks of me thinking, okay, well, what's the workflow going to be? How am I going to do this? Let's build all of my own technology to do this, because why make life easy for myself? And so ended up doing all of that. And so this was back in May of 2017. And I think one of the biggest problems that I had at the time was actually finding news about podcasting. It was, there was not an awful lot of news out there. And for the first couple of months, the hard job was, I need at least 4 stories for everything to work correctly. So how am I going to get 4 stories every single day? And some of it was literally just going through the release notes of podcast apps and going, well, Pocket Casts has a new app out now, and, and all that kind of stuff, which sounds like luxury these days, given that I've got so much news to cover. But it was a really enjoyable thing to be working on.
I must have found PodNews pretty early on. I think it was June 2017 is when I came on board finding it. Before that, I don't know if you ever heard of I don't even know if I want to call it an app, a web application, for lack of a better term, called Feedly. Had you ever heard of that before?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was using Feedly to just find any keyword about podcasting I could, just to keep up with what was happening. And like you said, once a week, I'm like, ooh, something about podcasting. And it's like new season dropped, like some like random press release. I'm like, okay, it's another true crime podcast. There's no real news happening here. And then you showed up. And like you said, at first, obviously, there wasn't a whole lot to report on, right? And now today, anyone who has subscribed to PodNews, which I encourage everyone, go to podnews.net and go ahead and subscribe now. It's very well done. And every day there's a lot happening in podcasting, and we'll get into that today. But again, James, I appreciate what you do, and sitting down, building out the code yourself and stuff like that. I think that actually adds a level of making sure that it stays healthy for everybody. So I appreciate anyone who's using their own code these days. So thank you again for that as well.
Yeah. No, it's good fun. Not always the best plan, but I think is the right thing for this particular thing. Yeah.
So one more thing in your history I've got to hear. Your first time speaking in podcasting. Can you talk about your very first experience on a stage when you were going over podcasting?
You've been doing your research. Yeah, so this was back. So I was working for the original Virgin Radio in London, and we had launched in March of 2005. We'd launched podcasting for the first time, and we were taking the breakfast show that we had and producing a podcast version of that show. And this was a long, long time. I mean, Apple hadn't launched podcasts yet in iTunes. You know, it was a long, long time in the past. And there was a podcast conference, which I think was called PodCon or PodcastCon in London in June of that year. And I was invited to speak. And what I didn't necessarily appreciate at the time is that there were an awful lot of people who had got into podcasting specifically because they hated radio. And they hated the gatekeeping, and they hated everything that radio stood for and everything that mass media stood for. And podcasting was their escape. And they were really unhappy that, you know, Richard Branson's radio station had got involved in, into podcasting. And yeah, I was shouted at for about 45 minutes, and that was a very humbling experience. But I was there specifically to see how much I could share about what we were doing, and hopefully won some people over, if not everybody. So yeah, it was a really interesting experience. Yeah.
And for everybody watching and listening today, that is why James is talking remote right now, so that you all can't throw things at him. Totally kidding. Actually, in second quarter 2023, James actually gave the opening talk at Podcast Show London, which I've heard. I believe the theater sat 400 plus people, but it was standing room only, which congratulations. I don't think anyone was booing you. So I'm very happy to hear it's come full circle for you. What a beautiful thing.
Yeah, no, it was really good. And it's, what a fantastic event that was. And, as a Brit, even though I live here in Australia now, but as a Brit, it's a very sort of weirdly patriotic thing to realize that we can put on a big show and not mess it up. And so, yeah, it was a good experience, and great to see how popular and how much podcasting is growing in the UK.
Yeah, I actually really love seeing that. Before we move on to the present day of podcasting, I do want to open it up, just go a little bit more general and kind of give it over to you. What's something that you have seen in podcasting in the past, it can be recent or long ago, a tool, a resource, an event, some sort of thing that happened to really bring the industry to where it is today? Has there been anything that's just really, that you kind of see as like that was a milestone that brought it closer to where it is today, excluding PodNews, because we all know that was the thing. But other than that, what else do you think it was?
Wow. I think, that's a good question. And I think that there are a number of different things that have brought it together. I think, obviously Spotify getting into the industry has moved the needle, not always necessarily in the right way, but I think, certainly it's increased the thinking of where podcasting is, and certainly increased the amount of people who are into podcasting, both in terms of consuming, but in terms of making them as well. So I think, Spotify getting involved in the podcasting landscape has been, really helpful overall for the industry. So that's a big change. But I also think, another big change is seeing Adam Curry, who of course invented podcasting with Dave Weiner, seeing Adam really getting involved in the nuts and bolts in podcasting again with the Podcast Index, which is his own directory. Well, I mean, it's all of our directory of podcast shows, which is available. But more than that, the new podcast namespace. So new ideas, new features, lots of really bright app developers making new things around podcasting, whether that's around paying, whether that's around accessibility through transcripts, and tipping buttons and stuff like that. Adam hates the word tipping. Sorry, Adam. But it's all that kind of stuff that I think has really changed and moved the theory of what you can do with a podcast app. So I think those two are probably one of the two largest.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk more about that a little bit later in the conversation as far as what Adam's done and kind of some of the changes we're seeing in the namespace of podcasting. But going back to Spotify, I agree with you. Spotify being one of the things, but also some of the other hosting providers that have popped up. At the end of the day, competition breeds accountability from the sense of we have to now innovate. We have to do something. The status quo gets challenged when competition comes in. And as soon as we saw Spotify come into the game, it forced everyone else to get a little bit better. Now, regardless of if Spotify is doing everything right or wrong, I don't want to get into the ethics of it, right? But the fact that someone else showed up and said, I can do this too, made everyone else say, oh, yeah, right? And we all are forced to level up. And because of that, I think that when you have the right amount of companies working in podcasting, hopefully with the right intent of serving independent podcasters, right? It elevates the entire industry. So I'm with you on seeing that being a big shift in the entire industry is when that happened. So where do you see podcasting at today, James? Like, where do you think that we're at? Like, where's kind of what's going on in the industry, more or less?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of driven by the original ideas that Adam and Dave Weiner had when they started podcasting, and very much deliberately built to be open, to have no gatekeepers, to allow anyone to publish podcasts alongside anybody else. And I think that that's something that podcasting has that, frankly, very few other media has. You can't operate a radio station next to everybody else because it's really difficult to get hold of a license, and it's really difficult to find the money to run the whole thing, and, et cetera, et cetera. It's very difficult to launch a new newspaper or a new magazine. But podcasting, it's really easy for somebody who is sitting in their, in their basement to launch a show which is available on all of the same platforms as all of the big shows, as the Joe Rogans and the, and the Mark Marons and everybody else. So I think from that point of view, that's the exciting thing about podcasting. And I think what worries me slightly is seeing a bit of a decline or a bit of, challenge to the open podcasting ecosystem. Whether that's through some of the things that Spotify have been doing, but more to the point, whether that's something that YouTube, as they wade into the industry, not fully understanding what makes podcasting great. I think that's something that we should just, be aware of. And just sort of look at in terms of, in terms of what we're actually doing there. So I think just being aware of what podcasting, of where podcasting came from, can help us understand what the future of podcasting is going to be.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I'm seeing Spotify, who at one point, I believe, said they want to become the YouTube for podcasting, and then that's obviously when YouTube was like, wait a minute, we're YouTube. We can do whatever we want, right?
Yes.
Neither of which fully understanding it. I think that Spotify's kind of, they tried a lot of things that didn't work, and they've kind of almost, I don't know what to call it, other than submitted to the default of what podcasting is, which is good to see that it had that much power, that it wasn't just everyone jumped ship and did the Spotify thing. And YouTube trying similar things. I guess we'll kind of see what happens. I know they have some plans, and it evolves so quick I don't even want to get into the details of it. But my hope is, again, that guys like you and I, along with the people that are kind of creating the tech behind it, RSS, right, that they can keep the accountability there as far as it just being open. So I'm excited about that. One of the things that I wanted to also ask you is, do you think that podcasting is healthy as an industry right now? And if yes or no, what metric makes you say that?
Yeah, I think, I think it's interesting when you look at what's going on in the US at the moment. Obviously, lots of media companies who are having difficult times with the economy right now, and you're seeing a lot of people that perhaps weren't set up particularly correctly in terms of their, in terms of their business anyway, finding it very difficult and having to lay off a ton of people. And I think people then point at podcasting. Oh well, it's podcasting, it's a bubble, blah blah blah. And I don't think that's the case. Actually, when you look at the revenue that podcasting is making, that revenue is outpacing every other form of online ad revenue. For example, both in the US. Here in Australia, in the UK, and so on and so forth. So I think podcasting itself is very, very strong. But I think that some of the larger legacy companies who've been involved in podcasting have just had a bit of a reset over the last 6 months or so. Somebody said to me, I was in New Zealand doing at a podcast conference there, and someone was saying to me, again in the pub afterwards. It's always in the pub afterwards, isn't it?
Of course it is, James.
Maybe I should look at that.
Maybe.
But,
That's why we brought you here today. So James, we wanted to talk to you. Okay, sorry, continue.
It's an intervention. As somebody was saying to me, if you look at how different industries start with lots of people throwing lots of money and just trying different things and seeing what works and what doesn't, and not frankly understanding what they're doing for a long time. And perhaps what we're doing right now is we're seeing large companies who are perhaps coming out of the stage of, throwing money against the wall, seeing what works and what doesn't. And now we're actually seeing companies who understand what works, who understand the things that don't work and that they should get rid of. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that reset, but that's very US centric. And I think, again, having spent the last week or so in Europe, I think one of the things that I have noticed in the European podcast market is just how much vibrancy and how much growth there still is in that market. And I think, some people say that the European market is 2 or 3 years behind the US market. I'm not so sure about that, but if that's the case, then I think what we're seeing is the Europeans learning from the US what works, what doesn't work, and can then actually get a little bit more of a heads up in terms of working out where the business is going to go to next. And just the amount of consolidation going on at the moment, the amount of, there's a very large Scandinavian investment group called PodX, and they are buying all manner of large companies at the moment, really amassing quite a talent bank of companies, and that's going to be, again, fascinating to watch what happens there. So I think Europe very much is the place to the place to watch and see where podcasting is going. Both Europe and I should say also the Arab countries as well, who really grabbing podcasting and using that as much as they possibly can.
It's encouraging to hear, because we have podcast guests and hosts listening today and watching, and the question is always, is podcasting healthy, right? Like, people want to know, I'm devoting time to this, I'm being a guest on a bunch of shows, or I got plans to release my 100th episode in a few months, right? Like, is this all still going to be here? And one of the metrics I always look at, James, is listenership climbing. Is listenership climbing? And if it is, that to me is the first indicator that it is healthy. Do you go beyond that metric, or is that one that you use as well?
Yeah, I think total listeners is a really important metric to have a look at. But I also think, and I'm more interested now by total time spent listening to shows. We've seen, the amount of people listening to podcasts every week continuing to grow, and that's a lovely thing. But for me, I'm much more interested in just the amount of podcast consumption that we can increase. Can we increase people? I think that the average shows listened to is somewhere in the region of 2.8 or 3 in most markets. Can we increase that to 4? Can we increase the amount of time that people are spending with their podcasts more? That to me is a much more interesting figure, because that is much more directly linked to money, is linked to all of that side of the industry. So numbers of people are great, but actually total consumption, including time spent listening, much more interesting from my point of view.
I'm with you on that. I've actually been sharing that metric a lot. I've been using this as the example. If I've got a show that 1 million people listen to, but the average completion rate for episodes is 1%, or I have a show with 1,000 people who listen to it and it has a 90-some-odd% completion rate, like just to the very end of it, right? Who has the better show? Is it strictly the downloads, or is it actually that people are listening to it and consuming the whole thing? And so most people will say, yeah, obviously the one that people are listening to. And so I love that you bring up that metric. I think that's a really important one for us to be focused on.
Yeah, and I think you can compare. So in the UK, for example, only 8 years ago there was 3 million hours of podcast listening a week. Now it's 91 million hours of podcast listening a week. So I mean, a massive growth. But that's the thing. 91 million hours is the thing. I think that's the metric that we should be looking at now, rather than the weekly reach metric, which is 23% or something according to these figures. That's a lovely figure, but actually I'm much more interested in time spent with the medium, because great content will improve that. And the longer that people listen, the more ads that they can be served. If you're interested in that sort of thing, the more money that can be made if you're interested in those ads. But on the other side, if you're looking at podcasting in terms of education or in terms of influence, then again, time spent with shows is a really important thing. So that's what I hope, and it's harder to get that stat, and so that's probably why we're seeing less of that and more of the just total audience. But I'm always interested in that stat too.
It's a very encouraging stat. I love hearing that. I imagine that's probably on par with what we're seeing in the U.S. as well. Hopefully globally, there's probably some average there that's probably close to that. So I want to talk about the future of podcasting. Where do you see it going? So let's just, obviously I don't want to be like, where do you see podcasting in 10 years from now? Because we don't know. But let's talk about just maybe
it's
the
only 20
next
years old anyway.
Months, right? Yeah, let's exactly. Let's double the age of it and see where it's at. No, but where do you see it being in at least the near future, maybe within the next year or so? And let's kind of talk through a couple of these points and make them actionable for people, so we're all positioned properly as guest and host to be able to really ride the wave of this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a content point of view, I think where podcasting is going is firstly making podcasts, the podcast that you do, accessible, and that means getting it on as many platforms as possible, making sure that you're doing transcripts, for example, making sure that you're doing chapter marks and all of the other stuff to make podcasts more navigable and more discoverable. Transcripts are great, obviously, for people that have poor hearing, but they're also great for people in particular environments where it's difficult for them to listen to the audio, but they can still consume stuff. But also what transcripts are great at doing is helping a discovery mechanism understand what the show is all about and what is being talked about in that particular show. And of course, if you look at the advertising side, it helps the advertising services understand what your show is actually talking about. You might be hosting a sports show, but you might be talking about new cars that you or your co-host has just bought. Well, that's a prime place to advertise a new car. So, if you can be cannier about that, then that really helps. So I think transcripts are a really important part of that. There's a bunch of tools and a bunch of podcast hosting companies that are adding transcripts and making sure that they're really easy and straightforward. RSS.com, which is a podcast host that I work with, they've added free podcast transcripts for everybody, which is nice, but you can also get free, I believe that Spreaker has free podcasttranscription.com or freepodcasttranscripts.com. It's one of those two, where you can get a full transcript of your show. And I think that's a really important thing. So on the just purely on the boring technical side, making sure that you're doing everything right in terms of your podcast is a good thing. So that's a great start. But I also think that people are getting more canny about editing their shows, making sure that every minute matters on their show. There's a lot of people that talk about how long should a podcast be and all of that, and my answer to that is always it's as long as it needs to be, but not a second longer. And I think we are, as podcasters, beginning to be a little bit more understanding that our audience have other things to do other than just listen to our shows. And so, good, tight editing is a good plan, I think.
Yeah, I say something similar. I said it when we got started. I say we typically go for 20, 25 minutes, but we go for ultimately as long as it's good, right? It's got to be good all the way through. And I think that's really important because in the day, because there are more and more options of podcasts and discovering them is becoming easier, if yours isn't delivering on the promise you're making, like if you're the guest or the host, if you're not delivering on the promise you're making that you're going to deliver, they're going to say, you know what, there's this other podcast, it's like 10 minutes shorter, and maybe it's delivering on the promise. And people are going to head over that way. So you want to make sure that you really are, again, if this is what your show is about, if this is what you stand for, you got to do it. So like James, perfect example would be is if you went on 5-minute rants in your podcast and in your newsletter about the surfing in Australia. It's like, man, that's cool, but that's not why we're here, right? Like you're going to lose some listenership and some listenership through that.
Yeah. No, exactly. So it's keeping consistent. It's making sure that you are offering your audience what they expect, but also, keeping it as being as respectful of their time as possible, is an important thing. So I think that's certainly one thing as content creators to be watching for. The other thing around where the very near-term future is going to be is seeing what happens with YouTube. YouTube has jumped into podcasting. This is Google's fourth or fifth time of jumping into podcasting, so we'll see if this one works. But clearly YouTube has an awful lot of people using them. So my suspicion is that we will see more podcasts which are like this, which are made both as a audio podcast, but also made as a visual thing to watch as well. I think that we'll see more of those, but I would just approach that with a little bit of caution in terms of where YouTube is coming, because one of the benefits of podcasting is that it's lots of different people all working together on one thing. You have hosts who sit there and they encourage new podcasters, they educate them, they help them move forward. You have lots of different advertising companies, you have lots of different companies who help with all manner of other parts of the podcast ecosystem. And YouTube does a very fine job of replacing pretty well all of those. So if YouTube, for example, turns into the most popular place that we all get our podcasts at this time next year, which I don't believe is going to happen, then that will probably put most of the podcast hosting companies out of business, most of the podcast advertising companies out of business, most of the podcast, PR companies, and all of the other bits that podcasting relies on. And I think that's a concern and a worry. I don't think that there's any chance of YouTube becoming that big, but we should just be careful in terms of what we do with YouTube, and what effect that might have on open podcasting in the future, I think.
I'm in agreement. We've got to be able to protect what we have here with podcasting. James, for sake of time, I want to go ahead and let you go here, and I really appreciate all the wisdom you shared today. But I do want to ask, do you have any final thought on podcasting, kind of where it's going and stuff like that? Something real brief to kind of encourage our listeners and viewers with today.
Yeah, I think that podcasting is a tremendous medium. It reaches so many different people. It's an incredibly intimate medium. And I think one of the things that I learned pretty early on is the difference that people consume radio and podcasting. Radio, half of people out there listen to radio with other people. For podcasting, it's 90% is listening on their headphones. It's a very, very intimate medium. It talks to people in ways that no other medium does, and I think it's a wonderful medium to be involved in. So go podcasting, as they say.
James, I love it. Thank you again for your contribution to podcasting, your curiosity and desire to help, just the passion you bring to the space. It's contagious, and I really appreciate you being the way you are. So thanks again for being here and just being yourself in this space.
Alex, thank you so much, and thank you for asking me on. I really appreciate it.